Hey writers again, this is Mr. Hoffman. So in the last video we were talking about ways in which we can support walking in our character's shoes and having our readers walk in our character's shoes. What I mean by that is really adding a lot of vivid detail into your realistic fiction. And we reviewed my story about Kenny, who was inspired from a small moment in my life with my son. So I'm going to hone in on one of these events and make a lot of detail into that. This video is for those who missed the lesson and need a little bit of a refresher on what we're doing. I'm going to be doing this live today during our work. So again, this video is just here as a support for you if you need that refresher or if you missed the instruction. So we're going to be adding dialogue and sensory details to one of my scenes. So I'm going to work on, I'm thinking, this one right here, event 2, where Kenny sees a shadow in the window one night and screams for his mother. Because we have that screaming part right there that can help us add dialogue, and we can add a lot of sensory details about him seeing the shadow in the windows. So this will be part of that narrative. So let's start off with setting the scene here. That text is a little too big. Kenny laid in his bed. I'm going to describe his bed now. His bed is dinosaur themed with rails on each side. Kenny tried to fall asleep. Kenny was rolling and rolling around. Finally, as his eyes became heavy, this is my sensory detail, you can imagine that. Finally, as his eyes became heavy, Kenny saw something move in the corner of his eyes. So let's look at here. Kenny laid in his bed. The bed was dinosaur themed with rails on each side. That's something that you could see with your eyes. That's a sensory detail. You can imagine those rails on each side. So I'm going to underline that in blue for sensory details. Kenny was rolling and rolling around. Again, another kind of sensory detail. Finally, as his eyes became heavy, sensory detail, Kenny saw something move in the corner of his eyes. Kenny began to quiver in fear. His palms were sweaty and tight. Kenny wondered to himself, what could that be? So again, let's look here at some of my sensory details. So things that you can see with your eyes, hear, smell, all of those. There's not really any taste in here, but let's look at those sensory details. So finally, his eyes became heavy. Kenny saw something move in the corner of his eyes. Kenny began to quiver in fear. You can imagine him shaking in fear, and his palms were sweaty and tight. Kenny wondered to himself, what could that be? So there's that dialogue component right there. I'm going to underline in red. So where do we go next with this story? Kenny laid in his bed. His bed is dinosaur themed with rails on each side. Kenny tried to fall asleep. Kenny was rolling and rolling around. Finally, as his eyes became heavy, Kenny saw something move in the corner of his eyes. I don't really like how that sounds with two eyes. I'm just going to change that. Something move in the corner of his room. Kenny began to quiver in fear. His palms were sweaty and tight. Kenny wondered himself, what could that be? So remember my story arc. The next part was he screams for his mother. So we need to add that in there. Kenny no longer could contain himself. He screamed the loudest he could, like a banshee. Mommy! Kenny's mom came upstairs to comfort him. Alright, so looking at this story here, we gotta refix this here. Kenny laid in his bed. His bed is dinosaur themed with rails on each side. Kenny tried to fall asleep. I'm setting that scene in your head. You can imagine his bed. Kenny was rolling and rolling around. Finally, his eyes became heavy. Kenny saw something move in the corner of his room. Kenny began to quiver in fear. His palms were sweaty and tight. Kenny wondered to himself, what could that be? Kenny no longer contained himself. He screamed the loudest he could, like a banshee. Mommy! Kenny's mom came upstairs to confront him. So a review of what I did to make you walk in Kenny's shoes. We had some sensory details. I'll highlight those since it got a little messed up. We said that you saw the dinosaur bed, that Kenny was rolling and rolling around. His eyes became heavy. He began to quiver in fear. His palms were sweaty and tight. And also down here, we have he screamed the loudest he could. So let's look at some of the dialogue. Those were the sensory details that helped us bring Kenny to life. And remember how we punctuate the dialogue with the quotation marks. What could that be? And mommy kind of helps you understand that Kenny is that 4-year-old boy that we said right here, right? He's not going to say, dearest mommy, I need you to come to me immediately. He's going to talk like a 4-year-old. So in your characters, make sure your dialogue matches them. Your sensory details will come naturally when you're starting to imagine the scene in your mind. But the dialogue is going to have to be something that you contrive or you create on your own. And it needs to have that coherence, which I mean by that is that it needs to make sense for your character. Your dialogue can't be something that's outlandish or doesn't make sense. So Kenny's not going to talk like an adult. He's going to talk like a typical 4-year-old boy. So today, as a review, I wanted to remind you that you need to add dialogue and sensory details into your writing. That'll help bring your character to life and have us walk in his shoes. Good luck, writers.